Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Amplify Your Social Media and Business Growth webinar. We have today Cassandra Arsenault joining us from Connect. She's an owner of Connect, which opened 3 years ago, and she studied psych, marketing, and digital marketing. She's a social media marketer and online business manager. And I'm really excited to have her join us today. And I really hope we're able to learn a few things from her today. I'll just pass it by to you, Cassandra. You can introduce yourself.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to talk. Normally when I come on, I talk a lot about social media. I talk about strategy, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of the things. I have done so many workshops in that regard. But something that I'm really excited to talk to you guys about as we're kind of closing out 2024 and moving into 2025 is a little more on the podcasting side. So we're going to still talk social media, but we're going to talk about podcasting in that process. And so I am Cassandra. I am the owner of Connect. I have been in business. We will be celebrating 4 years in November, which feels so crazy. I have gone through so many ups and downs through that process. Started off as a social media manager. So I was helping people create content and get it out on their social media, and moved into the back end of online businesses. And so I have helped run multi-million-dollar companies on the back end, systems, funnels, all of the processes that have to happen on the back end. And so I've seen kind of the ins and outs, and it has been really rewarding to see businesses grow and help other people take on new projects, work with new people, hire, all of the things. And so I'm coming to you today to talk a little bit more about social media and podcasting. But I have a lot of experience in so many different places. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we can open this up. Can you guys see this okay? Everyone seeing everything?
Yes,
Perfect.
we can. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So let me open up this as well. Okay. So I'm going to ask you guys to drop a couple things in the chat throughout our conversation today, to see where you're at, gauge your experience with podcasting, whether you have a podcast, you've been on a podcast, you listen to podcasts, you've never paid attention to podcasts. I want to know, in this collective right now today, where you're at with that, and then maybe encourage you to continue that route or change your strategy a little bit. So, hey, like I said, owner of Connect, no problem, Katie. Owner of Connect, aka your business bestie, online business manager and social media marketer. In many years ago, I studied psychology at Lakehead University. I did my undergrad thinking I was going to be a psychologist. In my second year, I took a marketing elective, loved it, and so moved into marketing after I finished my undergrad. Moved into Confederation College, did marketing there, and George Brown College out of Toronto, and did my digital marketing out of there. Then got a teaching position at Confederation College to teach marketing and psychology. And so I've had a lot of experience in like the education piece, and my business has allowed me a lot of experience in kind of that real world setting where I get to actually get my hands on businesses. And I've helped almost 100 clients at this point, with their businesses. My favorite platforms, generally Instagram. I spend day in and day out on Instagram. It's, a little concerning sometimes. And then LinkedIn, I really do enjoy spending some time on there and connecting with people in a different environment. My website, socials, emails, all linked here as well for you guys if you want to get in touch at any point. Okay, so let's talk about podcasting. Would love to know, does anyone here have a podcast? Drop it in the chat, raise your hand, whatever feels good for you. Does anyone here have a podcast? And if you do, you can also drop your link in the chat there too. Doesn't sound like anybody has one. Okay, that's okay. Do you listen to podcasts? Do you have a favorite podcast? Do you listen to podcasts frequently? Is it something that, you have on in the background every once in a while? Driving. I know a lot of people listen to them while they're driving. Okay, we got a couple people. Yeah. Okay. Do you know somebody who hosts a podcast? Do you have a friend, a business bestie, somebody Well, I mean, if you're listening to podcasts, obviously you know somebody who has a podcast. Do you know somebody closer to your circle that has one? And have you ever been a guest on a podcast? Have you ever been a couple but would love to be on more? Amazing. Okay. So we've been a guest on a podcast. Beautiful. So podcasting has taken off, especially over the last few years. Obviously, there has been a steady growth with podcasting, if you take a look at any of the stats. But over the last few years, it has taken us really, really, exponential growth, especially when COVID hit. Obviously, a lot of people were locked in their houses. We didn't have as much time. We had all this time to like, okay, well, let me pick up a book. Let me listen to a new podcast. And so that is where it kind of started that trajectory. And we've continued to build off of that. So there's over 2 million podcasts currently available in the world. And so you can imagine any topic you're interested in, business, personal, health, relationships, finance, dogs, whatever the heck you want, is probably podcasting. There's probably a podcast out there that shares more about that topic. Approximately 60% of Americans aged 12 and older have listened to a podcast. Over 100 million monthly podcast listeners are in the US alone. So 100 million monthly podcast listeners are just in the US alone. So imagine that worldwide. Podcast listenership has grown 25% year over year since 2019. Year over year, not total. That's year over year. We're growing by 25%. And podcasting is particularly popular among younger audiences, with 80% of listeners tuning in regularly between that 18 to 34-year-old. Now, obviously, that's not always the case. However, they're just taking the percentage over the ages that are tuning in regularly. So the people that are coming back week over week or month after month or day after day, where they're consistently listening to this consistent podcast, 80% 18 to 34. You want to start a podcast? Amazing. We're going to talk all about it. I'm ready for it. Okay. So obviously the game has changed over the years. So we have turned into audio customers, audio consumers. What I mean by that is back in the day, if you go way back, we used to sit down and watch TV quite frequently, right? Whether it was the 6 o'clock news or you'd watch cartoons in the morning on Sunday, you would be sitting in front of a TV. And so the whole family hung out in front of the TV. It would be like a social time, right? We're watching what's happening. You're running commercials in the background, right? So commercials were really high. We were very visual in that time. However, with the fast-paced world that we now live in, and we're moving and grooving, and the kids are all over the place, and we've got to get here, we've got to go there, we've turned into this audio consumer population. And so we've moved a little bit away from that traditional commercial piece. Video is still important when we talk about Instagram, that type of thing. But when we talk about the day-to-day, a lot of it is audio. Even hearing, there's a lot of transition, even on Instagram, there's a lot of transition from traditional texting, like with words and characters, to audio messages, right? People are sending each other voice notes and voice memos. And the reason for that is so that you can listen to it as you go. You don't have to stop and look at your phone and read what's happening. You can continue to get the information as you're moving and grooving throughout your day without needing to stop and focus on something. And so audio consumers we have turned into, and it's going to continue to rise. As you see that 25% growth year over year, that's going to continue to rise. Podcasting is super important, as my phone dings here. Podcasting is super important because it is very relatable and niche. So when we talk about podcasting, you can have a business podcast, right? You can talk about business all day long. There's so many different things that you can talk about within business that all kind of encompasses that business conversation. But when you start niching down, you start to relate to your audience on a deeper level. So when you think about podcasts, why do you listen to them, right? It might be because it's very specific about something. So I know there are many podcasts out there that talk about business finances, right? But there's not many people that talk about business finances when you reach that $1 million mark in your business, or when you start hiring people in your business, or you're Canadian, or you're international, whatever it is, right? You start to niche down, but your viewership grows because people want that conversation. So you can have a podcast about dogs, but when you have a podcast specifically about corgis, all of a sudden everyone who has a corgi or who loves corgis are like, wait, let me hone in on that. And they become more active listeners longer term because it's very specific to what people want to hear. People desire more intimacy, whether it's in your personal life or in business. We live in a world that's online, right? I have my entire business online. I have my home office and I see my clients through a screen all the time. There's very rare opportunities where I get to see my clients in person because they're all over the world. And so we desire more intimacy, and having somebody talk to you in your headset, whether it's in the car, in your earbuds as you're going for a walk, or just kind of in your house while you're getting your work done, it allows this opportunity for intimacy because you're hearing one, maybe two or three voices coming from the same source. And it makes you feel as if you're in the room with that person and that you're having a conversation with that person. Again, we're always on the go. And so podcasts, audio, that type of content really makes a lot of sense. Podcasts are also often more casual and unscripted. Now, they probably have an outline. Most podcasters have an outline of the direction in which they want the topics to flow. However, a lot of times, especially when they have guests, they're very unscripted, right? If somebody mentions something, hey, we're going to go over here, we're going to talk about this, we're going to run over here. And the reason for that is it allows the conversation to flow more easily. And like I said before, allows you to kind of feel like you're sitting in the living room with them. Like we're just having a conversation. And that is why podcasts end up being really popular, is because they don't feel, stuffy. They don't feel presentable like how this is. I'm like, okay, let me think about what I want to say. Let me lay it out. Let me make the slides. There is none of that, right? They have like a sticky note that kind of has an outline of conversation topics, but where it goes is up to the host and perhaps the guests that they have with them. And if it takes off on a tangent over here, we love that. Let's go do that and let's follow that as we go. Integration. So podcasts, you can listen to them anywhere, pretty much on any platform. That is the really huge benefit of podcasts, is that you don't have to have a specific app. You don't have to have a specific location to be able to listen to them. They're very accessible across the world on any different platform. There's sponsorship opportunities, so there's money to be made within there. There's also opportunity for your business to get in front of different audiences within that. And podcasts provide a lot of content, which I'm going to go into in the next slide, for social media, for emails, for all of the things. Okay, so when we talk about podcasts, a podcast episode, as you're recording it, could be 20 minutes. It could be an hour. If you're on Joe Rogan, it could be 3 hours. It really depends on where you're going with that, right? And so when you think about the podcast in that length of time, there's so much juicy information, whether it's just you talking to the camera or you have a guest that's coming in and talking. There's so much juicy information in there that you could make content for months with, right? Off one episode. So in addition to your content plan, your social media plan, whatever you're doing there, the podcast provides an in-depth piece to that. So let's say we are having a conversation. All of us, we're on a podcast. We all have a mic. We're talking about starting up our businesses. Okay. So let's go way back. Maybe it's a few years, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's yesterday that you started your business. You're going to go back. You're going to think about, when I started my business, what did that look like? When I got into this industry, what did that look like? And so we're going to have a conversation within that, hour-long conversation that we end up having. There are so many tidbits, quotes, snippets of the podcast, information, stats, things that we never thought about before that you can pull and share on your social media platforms. And so whether it's just social media, great. You can also do it through a blog. So if somebody said a stat that you were kind of surprised by, you can go and research that a little bit more and create a blog post on it. Or if somebody had a perspective on owning a business that you never really thought about, again, you can go into that, create a blog post on it. You can create an email newsletter on that. all linking back to that podcast episode so that they can listen to the full episode here. But here's a little bit of information, which allows you endless opportunities for content, because in an hour-long episode, you have, just endless amounts of different clips that you can pull, different quotes that you can pull, different images that you can pull from that. What podcasting does is it allows you to go deeper than just a traditional social media post, than perhaps a blog post would allow, right? Because if you're writing a blog post that's going to take an hour long to read, that's, tens of thousands of words right there. Whereas with a podcast, people are listening to it on the go. They don't have to stop and actively pay attention to it. They're just listening to it as they move through their day. And it allows you to go in depth with whatever conversation you're having. So instead of being that surface level, hey, here's how to grow your Instagram, I can go deep, deep, deep into that, give different examples, offer different situations in which you can adjust things. I can go into the statistics. I can go into how other people have done it, all of the things, so that we can really start to understand how that works. So what ends up happening is you start to establish yourself as credible. You start to establish yourself as that expert in your industry, because you're able to go deeper than a traditional social media or blog or newsletter post would. Talking about current trends, challenges, best practices within your industry is a great kind of reoccurring monthly episode. If at the end of the day you were like, I don't know what to talk about, pop up some news articles, pop up some trending things within your industry and talk about that. Because what it's going to do is it's going to showcase you as the expert, which then you become the go-to resource for your audience. They're like, Cassandra does a once a month social media trajectory or a prediction. Every year I do a yearly one. I'm like, what do I predict for 2024? And then at the end of the year, I kind of go back to those 2024 predictions for social media. And I'm like, oh yeah, you know what? That was good. Or this I missed the mark on, and here's how I think it's going to adjust. And so what that ends up doing is people look for that at the end of the year. They're like, wait, what were your predictions? And were they right? Where did you go with that? And then at the beginning of next year, I do the same thing. I'm like, 2025 predictions for social media. People start to look for that. They're like, what do you think is going to happen over the course of this year? So same thing. You become the go-to resource when you start to position yourself as that person. Also, inviting guests. Inviting guests can be a great way to promote yourself in their spaces, but it can also be a great way to show your audience that you have people within your circle that know what the heck they're talking about, right? Not only do I know what I'm talking about, but I also have connections that are experts in their industry, and that enhances your authority within the market. As soon as people start hearing that, oh, you know what? This person had this person on their podcast, or that I heard this on so-and-so's podcast, she had a guest there, or you guys were a guest on somebody else's podcast and you spoke about what you're really good at. It allows you to kind of position yourself as that authority within different people's worlds, not only for your own podcast, perhaps, but also for other people's podcasts. It boosts your reputation. It provides values to your listeners. So I've had many people be guests on Instagram Lives, on my own podcast, where not traditional, not the normal conversations that we're having, not the normal conversations that I'm having on my social media, but because they had a different view on something, we were able to kind of shift the conversation and learn more about how they experience the world that I kind of soak myself in every day. And when you are on a guest on their podcast, or vice versa, they're a guest on your podcast, it allows opportunities to build followers for both the podcast, but also your social media accounts, because they're sharing it with their audience or you're sharing it with your audience, and it kind of introduces you guys to new people. Okay, so a little bit about our process here. So obviously, if you have a podcast, we've got to record the podcast, right? And that process in and of itself can feel exhausting and overwhelming. Where do I get the equipment? What do I need? How do I do this? Where do I even start? And I'm going to talk about that kind of at the end. But let's say, you've got the things you need set up, and now you're just kind of in the recording process. So you record your episode. 20 to 40 minutes is the most popular episode time length that are listened to all the way through. So if you have, an hour, 3 hours, 4 hour podcasts, people will listen, I'm sure, for the majority of it. However, think about the reality, right? When you're driving to work, it might be a 20-minute drive to work. When you're bringing the kids to school, it might be, a 20-minute drive there. When you are cleaning up the house, it might be a 40-minute excursion, right? So you are putting it on and you're listening to it in those smaller chunks, which is why generally this is kind of that more popular time that people are listening to it all the way through. So you record the episode, you launch the podcast episode, and you share clips on your social media. That's the important piece here, right? How are we connecting this podcast to our other facets of marketing? Because if we're just doing the podcast off the top of our head and off the cuff, and we're not connecting it to any other pieces, it starts to lose its luster because oftentimes people aren't just going to happen upon your podcast. Considering there's 200 million podcasts out there, it's very rare that somebody's just going to happen to type in Sandra Arsenault's podcast because they don't know who the heck I am. They don't know I have a podcast. So think about that as you're doing your podcast process and marketing your podcast. You want to have that linked on your social media. You want to have that in the footer of your email. You want to have that on other newsletters that you're sending out. You want to have it in your business card. You want to have it in different places so that people can then know, hey, Sandra has a podcast. Follow your podcast, whatever it is, listen to it regularly, and then share episodes with their friends that they find relatable. Or, hey, you know what? I noticed this podcast episode talked a lot about finances within new businesses. Here's a great episode to talk all about that. So you record the episode, you launch the episode, and you share those clips on social media. There are a gazillion AI tools out there that you could play around with, and or there are many, editors such as myself, other people out there, or yourself that can just clip out, 10-second, 20-second, a minute long clips to put on your social media where you're talking really potently about X, Y, and Z topic. Maybe you leave them on a cliffhanger. Maybe you are, spewing facts and information that might surprise people. That would be a great clip to put on social media and link back to the full episode in your link in bio or the link directly on perhaps LinkedIn or Facebook where you can put the direct link. Always linking back to listening to the full episode here. Sending out an email to your email list to say, hey, we've launched a new episode and we would love to have you listen to it. Here's the link and here's a little clip of what happened, or here's a quote, or here's more about our guest. There's lots of opportunity that you can play with, always linking back to that podcast episode, but it allows people to get to know you and that you have a podcast through this process. So you're using both the podcast and the social media to kind of cross market with each other. If you have a guest, you got to tag them in the stories, tag them in the posts, invite them to be a collaborator on the Instagram reel, whatever that looks like, so that they can share it with their audience as well. And you're not losing that opportunity to connect with them and their people, because that is a really good benefit of having a guest on a podcast. And then stay consistent. So use it as a tool to grow your business. You can sponsor yourself on your podcast. So I had an event going on where on my podcast, I said, hey, which I need to get back to. This is why I'm doing this presentation, is to motivate myself through this process. I have so many episodes and I need to get them out. But that's kind of my Q4 plan. But within that, you can sponsor yourself through your episodes. So you can say sponsored by Connect Media or Connect Marketing, who is hosting an event here in wherever. So you can sponsor yourself through that. You can have other people sponsor you as well. So if you have a friend who is doing something, having an event, doing a workshop, launching a new product, you can have them sponsor your podcast. Share your workshops, your links, how to work with you, all of that kind of stuff can come through your podcast episode. So as you're speaking about social media strategy, I can then say, hey, this is my social media strategy. And if you need help with this, I would love to work with you in this capacity. So you're still pitching yourself through your podcast. You don't want to make it too much that people, get annoying and they stop listening, but you can absolutely pitch yourself through that process. I think we had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is on the sponsorship thing. If you can just, go back and elaborate a bit on how to do that. So when you talk about sponsorship, there is self-promotion, which I understand. which is what you just talked about. But others sponsoring you, and I think you mentioned that, there are sponsorship opportunities. Are these monetary opportunities? Are these reputational opportunities? Obviously, reputational opportunities, but if you can elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it, Cassandra.
Yes, of course. No, such a great question. So sponsorship opportunities can go so many different ways, right? They can be monetary, they can be product based, they can be in kind situations. What a sponsorship really ends up looking like is how you want to benefit from it and how the other person, it's like a collaboration essentially. So when you think about sponsorships, oftentimes you have to have some sort of reputable piece of reputable audience behind you, right? So if you're just starting your podcast, it's going to be a lot harder to get sponsorships versus when you've had your podcast for, 2 years and you have X amount of people tuning in every month repeating. So what often ends up happening is that when you get to a point, I do this with different things. When you get to a point where you've got a little reputation behind you, you've got a good engagement rate, people are following you, people are upkeeping on your episodes, you can then pitch your podcast to different people. And so you can send them a sponsorship letter, or, whatever that, some people do it via phone call like this or a Zoom call. Some people do it through letters and that type of thing, emails, whatever that looks like. But you can send them a sponsorship proposal essentially, where you say, here's my podcast, here's what we talk about, here's my stats on the podcast. I would love to have you become a sponsor of this episode specifically because we are going to talk about something relating to their business. Or you can say, I would love to have you as a sponsor for the next month to get your business out there, to get our business out there, that type of thing. I know there was a podcaster in Thunder Bay, Michael, who podcasted for years, and he had a few local restaurants be his sponsors. If you think about it on the radio shows, if you listen to radio every once in a while, you hear if they're doing a contest, they might say like $30 gift card to Jimmy's Pizza, right? That's a sponsorship partnership there. So what you're doing is you're going out to these businesses, you're going out to these people. It doesn't have to necessarily be businesses, but you're going out to people that you would find relatable for your audience, that would connect with your audience, as well as they might have information about their business that would be beneficial for this specific episode. And so you can write a sponsorship letter, you can go and pitch to them, but essentially you're pitching your podcast with your stats to these people. It could be monetary, like you said. Some people will sponsor it for gift cards. Some people will sponsor it for specific monetary value so that they can get their business in front of a different audience. So I run a marketing company. 99% of my clientele is female business owners, online business owners. So if you had a service or a product that you were like, you know what, I really want to get this out to more, or you're hosting an event, you're like, I really want to get this out to more female business owners, online business owners. I would love to use her audience as a landing page for that opportunity. You may then, as me, you may pitch to me and say, hey, I want my audience to grow with your audience. So I am going to offer you $500 to sponsor your podcast for the next month and a half as your ongoing sponsor. And so I gain the $500 from that. You're gaining the exposure to my audience. So it kind of goes both ways. Sponsorships, I almost like to think of them as like a partnership. And so you can play around with it. Obviously, you got to have some sort of momentum behind your podcast in order to start sponsoring from other locations. So I hope that helps answer that question a little bit. And perfect. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this a little bit more here. So why do podcasts work? Why do we listen to podcasts? Why do we spend time on podcasts? Why do they help grow businesses really quickly? So it positions you as the thought leader. For a long time, social media was doing this, right? We moved away from the commercials and we moved into social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok, Snapchat, Threads, Twitter, all of the things. There's so many, or X, I guess, all of the things, right? We moved away from the TV into social media, into our little TVs that are in our hands. And what ends up happening through that process is that you have more time, right? You have more exposure to people. Before, you had to pay $500 for a TV commercial that would air for 30 seconds once a day, or, once a week. Now you can show up as much as you want, and people can choose to listen to you or not. Podcasting is the same concept. You can choose to show up as much as you want, but what ends up doing is that this positions you as a thought leader in the industry. It positions you as the expert within that space, rather than only having a 30-minute segment where they dictate how often you can show up. You now get to dictate how often you get to show up. And so oftentimes, I don't recommend posting a podcast episode every day, but once a week, twice a month is a great cadence to growing your audience and also showing up as an industry expert. It encouraged people to follow along with your journey. So when you're staying consistent in your podcast episodes, people get to see your journey and your ebbs and flows within your business, within your relationship, within your life, within whatever you are talking about on that podcast. So instead of it just being, or throughout the industry, right? Instead of it just being something that you pop in every once in a while sporadically, if you think about, I'm going to go mortgages, right? Our interest rates have fluctuated over the last few years. Housing markets have fluctuated over the last few years. If you take a podcast that has shown up twice a month for the last, let's say, 4 years, you're going to notice within those podcast episodes how that has fluctuated, and you're able to follow along with that process. You could probably draw a map of how that is, right? So when you get to be that person, whether it's in the industry or within your own business, people start to follow along with your journey and start to listen to that advice. Yes, go ahead.
So question are as we're on the topic of, how often, to post. So two questions come to mind. One is, please tell me this is not another wacky algorithm where, some kind of, has some kind of equations are happy with me or unhappy with me, and therefore, I am either going up in the ratings or I am turfed. um, and then the second question is, who's behind what is the underlying software behind these podcasts? So what's the platform that these are on? It's just, this comes to mind. So who is, the owner of, you know uh, maybe there are several, but like what's the supporting, who is behind the scene? That's what I want to know.
Great question. So with podcasting, there's an algorithm to everything. And what that means is that there's just math involved, right? To watch the views, the engagement rates, all of those pieces. However, when you think algorithm with social media, it's not the same thing. And so when you say the algorithm hates me and that type of thing, it's not the same thing as social media. What the algorithm is testing here is, like we said, engagement rates, listener views, that type of thing. But podcasting is one of those opportunities where you don't have to show up 500 times a day. And please don't show up on a podcast 500 times a day, because that's not going to be beneficial. People are going to get inundated with information and be like, get me the heck out of here, right? They're not going to listen to your 5,000 episodes a week that end up happening. So what often happens is people will post, if you are really consistent with your podcast, if you are moving and grooving in podcasting, you're posting once, twice a week. That's a lot of podcast episodes if you think about it. When you think about big podcasters like Joe Rogan, he has a guest come in, they're doing 3-hour long episodes. It's not every day that he's doing that, right? It's, a few times a week where he's posting something, he's recording something, the team is editing and he's posting and that type of thing. So with my podcast, with your podcast, if you're just starting out in podcasting, I would recommend 2 episodes a month. That is a beautiful place to start. Grow your audience, build some sort of reputation, some sort of consistency, some sort of cadence over the course of, let's say, a year. That's 24 episodes in a year. It's not 400 episodes. It's not that type of thing. When we talk about who's watching these podcasts and who's like behind the scenes of podcasts, so you have the big companies, right? You have Spotify, you have Apple, you have I guess it's YouTube. It used to be Google. Google Podcast is now YouTube Podcast. They bought Google, or sorry, Google bought YouTube. But what ends up happening is that those platforms are what hosts the podcast. It's kind of a convoluted way of answering this. So there's apps, programs that will launch your podcast onto these platforms. So it's kind of like this little like launch pad where it takes your podcast that you said, I want to make a podcast. Sandra makes a podcast. Okay. This platform says, okay, where do you want your podcast to show up? You decide. Spotify, Apple, Podbean, Podcast. There's like a gazillion different ones, actually. There's so many different places that you can have a podcast. You decide what those are. And then it launches your podcast. Basically, it pitches your podcast to these places. Apple is the worst one. They take forever. Most of them do it overnight and they're like, here you go. We don't care. Sign up. Done. Apple then says, okay, who are you? What are you doing? What's this podcast about? It kind of reads a little bit more into it. Apple says, yep, no problem. Check. And now you're on Apple Podcast. You're on Spotify. You're on all these places. And so really who's mandating and governing that is the platforms themselves. So Spotify is the person. In the same way with your social media posts, Instagram, the people behind Instagram are the ones who are watching over your posts, making sure that you're following the rules, making sure all of those pieces are intact. And so the same thing kind of goes with that. And then from there, as a collective, through all of those different platforms, you get a rating on your podcast through that Launchpad program. So it says Apple had four people listen to your podcast. Google had 10 people listen to your podcast. Spotify had 20 people listen to your podcast. You've now had 50 people listen to your podcast total. So it pulls all the data from all the places into one spot for you. So that is where your ranking starts to move. Yes, more questions. Love it. Oh, I think you still need there.
Which ones are your personal favorite, your top three? And follow up to that is, do you post one podcast on simultaneous on various platforms? Like, I'll post it, I create a podcast, I'm going to post it on Apple, on Spotify, and on Google. And there is no exclusivity. You don't, you can, you're the and you own the IP rights, right? So the creator of the content, the podcast continues to be the owner of intellectual property rights. It doesn't go to Google or Schmoogle, or they
Yeah,
can do whatever they want with it and put it in AI content, or they do whatever with it, or is it your own, or do you own it? This is important.
absolutely. So I haven't recently read each individual's platforms, what their intellectual property rules are. So I don't want to misinform you and tell you something that I don't 100% know is like up to date and true. And so I believe that each platform would have their own kind of rules for and against that. So that would be something to kind of research a little bit deeper in the individual places. But like you said in that first question there, yes, it's one episode that gets pushed out to all these platforms and you get to choose what platform it is. So let's say Google said, no, we now own the rights to, my Google is going to go off in here. Hey, Google, stop. Google may know that let's say they say no, we have the rights to it. You can choose not to put your podcast there. You don't have to have it on all the platforms. But what ends up happening is you choose what platforms you want it on, and then that individual episode goes out to all those podcast platforms that you've chosen to go out to. Does that make sense?
So is there a place that you go to that has them all listed? Like you create it, and then so step one, I create my stuff. Step two, there's an aggregator on the
Yes.
internet of these things. Do you have a link to that?
Yep. So
Okay.
there is a it's escaping my brain right now, my sick head. There's a website that you would go to, or sorry, I think it's Podbean actually. Podbean, like Pod Bean, Bean. Podbean hosts all of these places. So you upload your episode to Podbean and Podbean pushes it out further than there. So you're not like going to Google and uploading your episode, then going to Apple and uploading, and then having 25 different episodes, or like having 25 different places that you need to upload it. This just takes that episode and shoves it to all the places that you want your podcast to be on. Yeah, does that
Your
answer?
favorite, your favorites, 3
My
favorites.
favorite. Okay. Spotify is super popular. That is where everyone is listening to their podcasts. I am a Google person. I've had an Android phone forever, and so Google Podcast was just natively where I listened to mine because I had that phone. However, the top three are probably Spotify, Apple, Google. Those are kind of the top ones. Spotify is a great one because it has your music and it has your podcasts. YouTube has done the same thing. So that's Google now. YouTube has taken your music and your podcasts and kind of put them in the same place. Apple I don't use, and so I don't have the experience, but I have heard it's also great. There are other platforms that have private podcasts. So if you have a membership or you have an exclusive community where you want somebody to pay to listen to these podcast episodes, there's also opportunities for that as well. So there's lots.
Example?
What's it called now? Oh my goodness. It will come to me.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I use it all the time. I don't know why it's saved in my, I'll check my Google because it's saved on my favorites in my bookmarks. But essentially, yeah, if you had like let's say this, I wanted to keep this private and teach this as a course, but have an audio version of it, I can upload it to there and then sell it through that program as well. So yeah, there's so many opportunities with podcasts. And I think that we talk a lot in our day-to-day lives and we have so much to share that podcasts can be a really great way to just get it out there and become that kind of industry leader in that process. You're already doing it anyway.
Thank you.
Of course, of course. Okay. So like I said before, there's money to be made in podcasts, right? On average, podcasters can earn $15 to $25 per per 1,000 downloads for sponsorships. So sponsorships often go off of downloads, people who are actually listening to your podcast, right? They're not going to throw money at you if nobody's listened to your podcast before. And so when I said that sponsorship package is important, it could be a one-pager that just introduces you. It introduces your podcast. It introduces the statistics. Who's listening to your podcast? What's the demographic of people? How many people are downloading your podcast? That type of thing. Then sponsors can come and say, okay, you know what? Considering you've had, 3,000 downloads in the last 3 months, here's what I'm going to propose as a sponsorship opportunity. Sorry. The other thing too with podcast sponsorships and just podcasts in general, if you want to be a guest, let's say you're like, I don't want to make a podcast. This seems crazy, but I do want to be a guest on more podcasts. Create a one-pager. A one-pager is, again, go into Canva, you could probably type in podcast guest template. And what it's going to do is it's going to give you a little template that kind of introduces who you are. What do you do? Who are you? What kind of topics do you want to talk about? How to get in contact with you? How many speaking things have you done? Are you new to this? Whatever that is, you don't have to have speaking engagements to be on podcasts. But what it does is it allows an opportunity for somebody like myself who has a podcast to look at that and say, you know what, Sam looks like a great fit for my podcast. I can't wait. Let's invite them on. Or, hey, so-and-so seems like she would be good for this podcast. I'm going to refer her over so that we can, connect her that way. So think about these types of things as you're kind of leaning into this podcast space. If you're like, I don't want to make one yet, but I want to be on more, that can be a great opportunity to just pitch yourself in a really easy way. So you're not having to type that out every time you're like, I want to be on this podcast, because here's my one pager. Here's what I talk about. Here's what I know really well. Here's topics that I hate talking about. Have a great day. If I feel like a good fit, I'd love to be in your world. High engagement rates. Podcasts have high engagement rates. 80% of listeners complete episodes. That's huge. If you think about like your social media engagement rate, if you think about any other platform like Instagram, I'm going to use Instagram. When you think about your reels, the videos, if you have a minute long reel where you're talking, your engagement plummets because people aren't listening that long. They're not paying attention that long. Whereas podcasts, people are there to listen. They know what they're doing when they come into a podcast. They're there to commit to listening. And 70% of people say that they pay close attention to the ads. So not skipping them, not moving forward from them, especially when you have those juicy, good ads that kind of catch you and you're like, wait, what are you talking about? People will listen to that. So podcasts have a really, really good place in the industry right now for ads, for listening, for engagement, for growth. It's kind of crazy. Podcast advertising industry is projected to reach $2.5 billion in revenue by 2025. So like we're moving. We are on the upward trajectory for sure. There's lots of money to be made within podcasting. I'm not here to say that I'm going to make a gazillion dollars off podcasting, but in turn, what I'm doing is creating content, using it, repurposing it in different locations. So it's like one content piece that I'm creating and then repurposing it, as well as diving deep with my audience, having guests, so exposing my audience to other people and exposing their audience to me, and then building a reputable brand around that piece so that when I do go to speaking engagements, when I do something like this, hey, I have a podcast. I do this all the time. I love public speaking. Bring me on stage. I want to have you as a sponsorship because of this is my podcast. This is my engagement rate. These are all the opportunities that I've created within that space. And as long as you stay consistent, consistency is key across like our entire lives, but consistency is the key to this. So if you can launch 2 podcast episodes a month, which will probably take you 5 hours each episode, if you think about recording it, editing it, uploading it, creating the things. If you can block out 10 hours a month to focus in on your podcast and get 2 episodes out, you'll be okay. You will grow, you will build. Sharing it on your social medias, sharing it in your newsletters, connecting with other podcasters, other people, you will grow that podcast. And who knows, you might be one of the people that are like in the top 10 podcasts of, Spotify. There's many podcasts that don't have a million, a gazillion views a month that are up there because they're consistent with it. So something to think about. It doesn't have to, the ratings don't always depend on how many people are listening to your podcast. It also depends on how consistently you're showing up and how many people are coming back to listen to that. Okay, so where to start? I have a program called the Podcast Launchpad, which is essentially you and I sit down, we have a meeting, and I say, okay, what do you want your podcast to be about? What do you want to do here? Let's like brainstorm, let's brain dump, let's get this all out. I take all that information and I create that launch pad for you. So where I talked about, I build your social media assets, I build your intro, outro, I build your podcast branding, your topic list, editing tips, all of that kind of stuff. I essentially build all that back end stuff so that after the launch pad is built, you can just start recording episodes and uploading them to this platform. So instead of trying to sit down and be like, oh, I don't know how to do the branding. I don't know what to call my podcast. I don't even know where to start. We talk about equipment. We talk about all of that kind of stuff to build you to a place where you can just sit down, record an episode. If you don't want to edit it, you don't have to. You can upload it. If you want to edit it, you can do it. I can do it, whatever that looks like. But we build you the base of your podcast so that you can start recording on the back end of that and just get moving in your world. Okay. Thank you guys so much for listening, for hanging out. Let me find that it is called oh my goodness. Oh, I cannot believe I'm drawing such a blank on this. This is very odd. I'm gonna find it. Hello Audio. Hello Audio is the platform that you can have the private podcast on. Let me drop a few resources in the chat here for you guys as well. Any questions, any thoughts, any things you want to just chat about around podcasting, around social media?
I think you didn't finish this thought because you said we were on TV commercials, TV/commercials, then we moved to social media, the Facebook, the Instagram, and then you're like, and now we moved to
Oh,
podcasting.
and now we're moving to that audio place, right? Where a lot of it was visual. When you think about social media, there's a lot of pictures, right? Instagram had photo before Reels came around, we had photos, we had that type of thing, right? So social media was full of visuals. So we had the video type of thing, we had the commercials, we had the photos, and now it's all turning into this audio. It's quick information. We're moving. We don't have time to sit down and watch, an hour-long YouTube video. I'd rather just listen to it in my ears and do what I need to do as I'm listening to it. So we're definitely moving into that more fast-paced world, as we all know. But that audio generation is going to be key in the next few years for sure.
But Cassandra, this may be counterintuitive, but I feel this is essentially where we were forever, for centuries, for millennia, just listeners.
Storytellers, right?
TV commercials, relatively new, right? 20th century stuff. So before that, I mean, we were listening to each other and maybe we missed it. I don't know. It's like, we're just going back to be, it seems like such a natural thing to do. Just, yeah, you're telling me a story. I love it. I'm gonna listen to it. It seems to me like, in fact, when I listened to your presentation, which was excellent, by the way, thank you. Um, like we're just going back to human nature, and so the growth potential, if it maps to who we are, sure, as humans, right? So yeah, maybe we're over the beer commercials that cost a million of whatever they cost during a Super Bowl, right? Right.
Well, it's so true, right? Like when you think about traditional, it was storytelling. That's
Yeah,
all, right? And that's what podcasting is. It's storytelling. It's the same. It's getting back to just that audio and hearing. Obviously, there's visual podcasts and having the recording as well. Some people do enjoy sitting down and watching it like an episode of Netflix, but it's storytelling, and that's what people really love. And like you said, we are definitely getting back to
basics.
just telling the stories, telling what we know, sharing our information.
Good. It's
Amazing.
reassuring.
Yes, for sure. I agree.
I just have a question regarding like promoting podcasts. I know like on social like Instagram, TikTok, things like that, usually you can boost your posts. That way it's like it reaches out to a wider audience. There's like all this podcast platforms, they have things like boosting where it's like if you're I mean, obviously there are ways that people can find you on social media, but if you're on the platform, is there a way that you can boost your post that other people can just find it based off the boost, or is it
So
mostly through that social media platforms?
which is a great question. So what ends up happening is on social media platforms, you can promote your episode through there. On the actual podcasting platforms, you're creating an ad to your podcast. So you create an audio ad that says, "Are you feeling confused about social media and completely overwhelmed? The Connection podcast is the place for you." And you create this like 30-second ad clip that plays inside of other people's podcasts. So think about it as like a YouTube ad. I don't get to choose when I upload a YouTube video. Let's say I'm famous and I have the subscribers that I would need to do this. When I upload the YouTube video, I get to choose where the ad goes, but I don't get to choose what the ad is. So YouTube's algorithm will choose which ad goes where. So when you do, like, let's say Spotify, if you wanted to make an ad for your podcast, I'm sure you've actually heard other people's podcast episodes play as an ad throughout another podcast. Thank you so much. No problem. Thank you so much, Katie, for being here. Take care. That so you can create a 30-second clip that will play inside of, let's say, my podcast. When I say Spotify, make me the ad, I don't care what it is, your clip could then be a potential within my podcast to play. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a commercial break in a YouTube video.
Oh yes, it does. I've heard a bunch of podcasts, things like that happen in some podcasts, and I'm wondering like what's going on. But
You're
it
talking
makes so much
about
sense.
And now we're talking about dogs. Okay, right. That's what ends up happening is that you create those clips and that's the way to advertise a podcast
Mm-hmm.
in a podcast, if that makes sense. So yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
I think Sam has a question too.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so like if podcasting, like starting your own podcast isn't necessarily on the roadmap at the moment. However, um, like you said, the stats, like there are 2 million podcasts, there are probably every topic that's being covered, and the engagement with ads itself is 70% on podcasts. The question is, how do you find, like, even if you niche down on like the podcast you would like to use for your marketing strategy, how do you find the stats, or is there like a good way? Because let's say I'm starting out in my journey, right? So I have a restricted budget of how much I can, pay them. How do you find those niche? Because at least on Instagram, you can see, oh, there's these many followers, there's much of engagement. I think on podcast, there isn't really a straight line like that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a great question. So depending again on the different platforms, if you go to Spotify, they have a lot of what's like reports essentially. So usually they do like a year-end report on like what the most popular topics were, what people were talking about on podcasts, how many listeners. So they'll have like these reports that they build kind of either every quarter or every year that they lay out those types of things. Another great way is to just open conversations with people in that industry. So if you have a podcast that especially not necessarily the giant ones, but the smaller ones that have, consistent listeners, you can see how many downloads are on each podcast, that type of thing, or how many thumbs up, that type of thing. So if you have a podcast that you kind of listen to regularly and you're like, I really like this podcast, I want to know more about it, you can always reach out to the actual hosts of the podcast and just say, hey, I really love your podcast. I want to know more information on like your back end stats. It's something that I really admire what you're doing, and I want to talk about X, Y, and Z on my podcast eventually. I just want to learn more about that process. A lot of people are very open about things when people ask. They're not going to just show everybody, like, look at all these information that we have. But when you inquire about things, a lot of businesses are like, sure, because at the end of the day, what's the benefit or harm to them? It's a number. They don't care. It's not like they're giving you their email list and now you have all these people, right? They're like, sure, here's the download on the back end. So I think just kind of opening yourself up to looking at the reports from the actual companies, Spotify, Apple, that type of thing, and then going into, perhaps some people that you really admire and asking. And if they say no, they say no. But a lot of people that I've run into are like, sure, yeah, all right, I never had anybody ask me that before, or yeah, sure, it doesn't matter to me. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions, topics? Thank you guys so much for hanging out today.
Cassandra, sorry, did you say it was Google Reports?
Google, so Spotify will have it. Google podcast. Is it, yeah, so YouTube has their own podcast. So Google and YouTube are the same now, and so it's now YouTube's podcast platform. So yes, YouTube. Even if you just Google YouTube podcasters report, I don't know if they have the updated one for this year yet, but kind of at the end of the year, if you start to pay attention to that stuff, like in November, December, they'll start to post. I know Metro Cool for social media does a huge year-end report where they do the stats.
Metro Cool?
Metro Cool, yeah, Metro Cool. They do a large report kind of at the end of the year again, that goes through all of the things, that goes through all of the platforms, goes through all of the stats that they have, and kind of then predicts like, hey, this is where we think this is going to go, or
Trending.
exactly.
Yeah.
Who's on social media, how long people are spending on social media, all of that kind of stuff. So they have a budget.
Metricool.
Yeah.
Metricool.
Yeah. So they're
Like metrics.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if they have it out yet.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, how are you guys feeling?
It was really very informative, really good. Thank you.
I'm glad. Wonderful. If you guys
I,
have,
I
sorry.
yeah, I think you could have 3 more of these on, even like just other, the sponsorships, like different things, how to build a 20-minute podcast, things, other workshops that may be nice to have.
Yeah, I'm sure there's so many different things that we could talk about. So if you guys have any questions after this, if you want to chat more, you can always find me on social media. But yeah, I hope to see you guys again soon talking about podcasts, social media, all of the things. It was just great to have you here and so engaged, and I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks for joining us today, Cassandra. And yeah, your information is in the chat, so everyone can definitely go in there and look at that. And if there are no more questions, I think we're recording this, so I'll just stop the recording now. And if there are no more questions, I guess we're all good to go. Yeah. All right, perfect. Thank you.
Guys.
Bye.
Have a beautiful